Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and you're joining me for a lecture on John Locke's arguments to show that God exists. This is the second of two. We're looking at a selection of readings from his An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. I'll show you the book when I switch over to his writing. And we're considering book 4, chapter 10, where he says we can know with certainty there is a God. And he even likens it to mathematical certainty. So very high level of certainty. So you might go back if you haven't seen that lecture and check that one out. And here we're going to look at the second half of that chapter and how it continues his arguments. I'm going to toggle between notes and his writing. Let me show you his writing first. I'll scroll back up to the top. Here's what we're using. It's his essay from the Great Books of the Western World, Volume 35, Locke, Berkeley, and Hume. I'm fond of this series. There are maybe more up-to-date ones with more up-to-date language, but I think this one's really good. For our purposes, it's fine. And I also put the specific edition here, 1988 set, so you know about that. And then we covered this first part already, and we are going to pick up here with the idea, I skimmed past it, with whether or not we know God exists from an idea of God. Let me give the argument. Some people say everyone has an idea of God, and that proves God exists, because where else would they have gotten it from? In fact, Descartes uses something like that argument, but the more common one is called the sensus divinitatis. Everyone has a sense of the divine. Now, to have a sense of, quote, the divine is not the same as a sense of God. As we saw, what's meant by the term God is an eternal spirit who, the properties Locke's gone over, has all power and all knowledge. So, for example, and only is eternal. Nothing else is eternal. So, for example, the way Plato and Aristotle use the word God, that doesn't apply, because for them, something else is eternal with God. The way that Aquinas uses it in natural theology is like Aristotle. And Aquinas said, we can't know from reason that the world had a beginning. Whereas Locke says, yes, we can. We can know with certainty that the world had a beginning, that it's not co-eternal with God. Only God is eternal. So the idea of God doesn't tell you that God is real. There are other ways to explain how people could have gotten the idea of God. There's books about evolutionary psychology and why the idea of God might have been put into people through the survival of the fittest. I mean, I'm not suggesting those are true either, just that asserting this idea is from God doesn't make it so. So I'm going to toggle to our notes now. So even if there is a universal idea of God, this does not tell us that God is real. There could be universal and mistaken ideas. So some think this is what Romans 1 teaches. When it says that all persons know God from the creation. They think it's referring to this, something called a sensus divinitatis. But it's important to see that what it says in Romans 1, and Locke's just about to quote that to us, is that it is from creation. The general revelation of God in all his works of creation reveal the nature of God, not an innate idea that all persons have. In one way, this is like, it's an attempt to get around the need to give arguments. I don't need to give arguments because everyone already knows God. And Locke is saying, no, you do need to give arguments. And even if everyone had an idea of God, that's not the same as knowledge. Knowledge as understanding requires we can give sound arguments to show our conclusion is true. So let's go back to the reading here and see how he's going to develop this. So the idea of a most perfect being is not the sole proof. And he says, look, there are different kinds of minds framed in different ways. And so different arguments appeal to different people. He's fine with that. I mean, it has to be a sound argument. You might be presented with two sound arguments and you like one of them and you just don't like the other one, and someone else is the reverse. Okay, as long as they're both sound. But I think this I may say that it is an ill way of establishing this truth and silencing atheists to lay the whole stress of so important a point as this upon the sole foundation of an idea that everyone has, supposedly. Because how would you know if everyone has it? Have you asked everyone? And take some men's having that idea of God in their minds, for it is evident some men have none, and some worse than none, and the most very different. So he says, yeah, not everyone has this. Some of them have none, and some of them have worse than none. If that's the only proof of a deity, and out of an over fondness of that darling invention, cashier, or at least endeavor to invalidate all other arguments, and forbid us to hearken to those proofs as being weak or fallacious, which our own existence and the sensible parts of the universe offer so clearly and cogently to our thoughts, that I deem it impossible for a considering man to withstand them. Now, he's not talking just about ontological or a priori arguments, because he gives something like that when he shows something must be eternal. He shows how there's a contradiction between the idea of non-being giving rise to being. And that's a kind of ontological argument. The impossibility of that means the other thing is true. So he's not opposed to that type of argument. He's opposed to going from just the idea of God to the existence of God. For I judge as certain and clear a truth as can anywhere be delivered, that the invisible, and here he quotes Romans chapter 1, the invisible things of God are clearly seen from the creation of the world, being understood from the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. So there he's quoting that. And you'll see, I understand it doesn't, I wanted to see if it had. So though our own being furnishes us, as I have shown, with an evident and incontestable proof of a deity, and I believe nobody can avoid the cogency of it, who will but as carefully attend to it as to any other demonstration of so many parts, yet this being so fundamental a truth, and of that consequence, that all religion and genuine morality depend thereon, I doubt not. But I shall be forgiven by my reader if I go over some parts of the argument again and enlarge a little bit more on them. So he's going to recapitulate what he's already gone over, but he also answers some new objections in here. That's why I want to do this as a second part. So here he quotes Romans 1. Anyone can know these things about God who takes the time to pay attention to the arguments. Anyone can know those things about God if you take time to pay attention to the arguments. And so the consequence or the blame for not knowing God is squarely on the person who doesn't know. There is general revelation available to all, and you didn't give time to think about it. Romans 1 calls this without excuse, or no excuse for unbelief. So now let's look at one of the recapitulation of the whole argument. The first thing is that something has existed from eternity, and that there's no truth more evident than this. And that's not an empirical argument, an a posteriori argument. It's a priori argument. I'm thinking here specifically about another series of lectures I've given that's on my YouTube account on David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, because he makes a big deal about dividing those two kinds of arguments. Demia is for the ontological argument, and Cleanthes is for the design argument, and they go at each other for this. So I've never heard of anyone so unreasonable, or that could suppose so manifest a contradiction, as a time wherein there was perfectly nothing. This being of all absurdities the greatest, to imagine that pure nothing, the perfect negation and absence of all beings, should ever produce any real existence. So where does he begin? Oops. Something has existed from eternity. Good. Now where to go? Next, two sorts of beings, cogitative, and incogitative. I use matter and spirit, or cogitative means thinking, spirit, incogitative, matter. There are two sorts of beings in the world that man knows or conceives. First, such as are purely material without sense, perception, or thought, as the clippings of our beards and parings of our nails. Secondly, sensible, thinking, perceiving beings, such as we find ourselves to be, which, if you please, we will hereafter call cogitative and incogitative beings, which to our present purpose, if for nothing else, are better, perhaps better terms than material and immaterial. So he picks those, okay, because he gets to the idea that the immaterial is the thinking. Two kinds of being. Cogitative, spirit, and incogitative, matter. Spirit or soul, I'm using those synonymously. All right. Incogitative being cannot produce a cogitative being. If then there must be something eternal, let us see what sort of being it must be. And to that it is very obvious to reason that it must necessarily be a cogitative being, for it is impossible to conceive that ever bare incogitative matter should produce a thinking intelligent being, as that nothing should of itself produce matter. Let us suppose any parcel of matter eternal, great or small. We shall find it in itself able to produce nothing. For example, let us suppose the matter of the next pebble we meet with eternal, closely united and the parts firmly at rest together. If there were no other being in the world, must it not eternally remain so? A dead, inactive lump? Is it possible to conceive it can add motion to itself, being purely matter, or produce anything? Matter, then, by its own strength, cannot produce in itself so much as motion. The motion it has must also be from eternity, or else be produced and added to matter by some other being more powerful than matter. Matter, as is evident, having not power to produce motion in itself. So, just by considering the natures of the two, matter is not able to produce anything by itself. It must be acted upon. And he uses the example of a pebble to highlight that. So if there'd only ever been matter, there would still only ever be matter. But let us suppose motion eternal too, yet matter, incogitative matter and motion, whatever changes it might produce of figure and bulk, could never produce thought. Knowledge will still be as far beyond the power of motion and matter to produce as matter is beyond the power of nothing or non-entity to produce. And I appeal to everyone's own thoughts whether he cannot as easily conceive matter produced by nothing as thought to be produced by pure matter, when before there was no such thing as thought or an intelligent being exists. Divide, and here he's going to give us an argument, so pay careful attention, read it multiple times if you need to. You can pause the video and read it. Divide matter into as many parts as you will, which we are apt to imagine a sort of spiritualizing or making a thinking thing of it. Vary the figure and motion of it as much as you please, a globe, cube, cone, prism, cylinder, etc., whose diameters are but 1/100th part of a gree or grai, which is a tenth of a measurement of a line. So this is before all our discoveries in the atomic world. So he's saying super small, and whatever motions and shapes you want will operate no otherwise upon other bodies of proportional bulk than those of an inch or a foot or diameter. And you may as rationally expect to produce sense, thought, and knowledge by putting together in a certain figure and motion gross particles of matter as by those that are the very minutest that do anywhere exist. What does matter do? Well, they knock, impel, and resist one another, just as the greater do. And that is all they can do. So some people will say, well, the spirit is refined matter. The spirit's super tiny. So it's in your body, but you can't see it. And you say, no, no matter how big or small a material item is, it has a certain shape. It bumps into other items. And that's still true in our current, it might have fields. Instead of electrons bumping, they have fields that repel or attract each other. But that's what they do, whether they're big or small. There's no thinking going on. Thinking is not due to size or motion. So if we suppose nothing first or eternal, matter can never begin to be. If we suppose bare matter without motion eternal, motion can never begin to be. If we suppose only matter and motion first or eternal, thought can never begin to be. For it is impossible to conceive that matter, either with or without motion, could have originally in from itself sense, perception, and knowledge, as is evident from hence. That then sense, perception, and knowledge must be a properly, eternally inseparable from matter and every particle of it. Not to add that, though our general or specific conception of matter makes us speak of it as one thing, yet really all matter is not one individual thing, neither is there anything that exists as one material being or one single body that we know or can conceive of. Because everything is a collective put together of smaller parts. And therefore, if matter were eternal first cogitative being, there would not be one eternal infinite cogitative being, but an infinite number of eternal finite cogitative beings, independent of one another, of limited force and distinct thoughts, which would never produce that order, harmony, and beauty which are to be found in nature. Since, therefore, whatsoever is the first eternal being must necessarily be cogitative, and whatsoever is first of all things must necessarily contain in it, and actually have at least, all the perfections that can never after exist, nor can it ever give to another any perfection that it hath not either actually in itself, or at least in a higher degree, it necessarily follows that the first eternal being cannot be matter. So his argument that thinking is not material, thinking is not a complex of size, motion, etc. No amount of motion or material objects equals a thought. Thoughts are either true or false, and these are not properties of motion. And then he says, only a thinking being can have existed from eternity. Matter can't have existed from eternity. He gives the argument why. And then, therefore, there has been an eternal cogitative being. If, therefore, it be evident that something necessarily must exist from eternity, it is also as evident that that something must necessarily be a cogitative being. For it is impossible that incogitative matter should produce a cogitative being, as that nothing, or the negation of all being, should produce a positive being or matter. So the same certainty we have that something is eternal, we also have that what is eternal is cogitative. Because of the same thing. The alternative leads to a contradiction. Now, could the eternal mind also be material? Perhaps it will be said that though it is as clear as demonstration can make it that there must be an eternal being and that being must also be knowing, yet it does not follow that that being may also, yet it does not follow, but that that being may also be material. Let it be so. It equally still follows that there is a God. For if there be an eternal, omniscient, omnipotent being, it is certain that there is a God, whether you imagine that being to be material or no. Now, and yet I think that would raise some serious problems. So give him a second here. But herein, I suppose, lies the danger and deceit of that supposition. There being no way to avoid the demonstration that there is an eternal knowing being, men, devoted to matter, would willingly have it granted that this knowing being is material. And then letting slide out of their minds or the discourse the demonstration whereby an eternal knowing being was proved necessary to exist, would argue to all being matter, and so deny God, that is, an eternal cogitative being, whereby they are so far from establishing that they destroy their own hypothesis. For if there can be, in their opinion, eternal matter without any eternal cogitative being, they manifestly separate matter and thinking and suppose no necessary connection of the one with the other, and so establish the necessity of an eternal spirit, but not of matter, since it has been proven already that an eternal cogitative being is unavoidably to be granted. Now, if thinking and matter may be separated, the eternal existence of matter will not follow from the eternal existence of a cogitative being, and they suppose it to no purpose. So it's an interesting kind of argument. Could God have an eternal body? He initially grants it, but says it leads to nothing because of the difference between matter and mind. These are always separable. You can't ever think that mind is matter. And so if God existed from eternity, God is necessarily cogitative, but not necessarily having an incogitative body. And he gives a kind of prudential argument against it. Of all of his arguments, I think this one's the weakest. I think his other arguments are right on. They're spot on and sound. I think this one's his weakest one. And he really just needs to show how, use the same the same type of argument he's been using to show how the nature of matter is such that it can't have existed from eternity. But he's already given, I think, the pieces of how he would do that. Now, 14, no material. First, because each particle of matter is not cogitative. But now let us see how they can satisfy themselves or others that this eternal thinking being is material. I would ask them whether they imagine that all matter, every particle of matter, thinks. This I suppose they will scarce say, since then there would be as many eternal thinking beings as there are particles of matter, and so an infinity of gods. And yet, if they will not allow matter as matter, that is, every particle of matter, to be as well cogitative as extended, they will have as hard a task to make out of their own reasons a cogitative being out of the incogitative particles, as an extended being out of unextended parts, if I may so speak. So the which particles of matter think? Every single one? And he says that'd be impossible. No. So which collections of them think? Adding up non-thinking parts to get a thinking being is like adding up zeros to get a number. You don't ever get to some number if you keep adding up zero. 0 plus 0 plus 0 doesn't give you 1. So the same thing here. None of the parts of matter are thinking, but if you add 10 of them together, they're thinking. Now, someone will say, that's not true. Hydrogen and oxygen aren't wet, but if you add them together, you get H2O, you get water, which is wet. Slow down. Water is a property of extension, or wetness, I mean. Wetness is a description of how something flows, how a material object, wood is solid, water is wet, flowable, to use a made-up word. So that's still an extended property. You're not going from an extended property to a non-extended property of thinking. So that's the first part. The absurdity of saying matter can think. Any size of matter, any collection of matter can think. And then the attributes of an eternal cogitative being. Though this discovery of the necessary existence of an eternal mind does sufficiently lead us into the knowledge of God, since it would hence follow that all other knowing beings that have a beginning must depend on him. So in here is a proof that our soul had a beginning. A side note proof that our mind or soul had a beginning because we are finite and dependent. And whatever is eternal mind is infinite and independent, unchanging. We're changing. Ooh, that's a bad one. And I don't know what this word is. So that's an interesting point there to see that argument. Okay, so all inanimate beings, whether by his omniscience, power, and providence, will be established, and all his other attributes necessarily follow. Yet to clear up this a little further, we'll see that doubts can be raised against it. All right, so let's get these doubts. Whether the eternal mind may also be material or no. First, perhaps it will be said that though it be as clear as demonstration can make it, that there must be an eternal being, and that being must also be knowing, yet it does not follow that thinking being may also be material. Let it be so. It equally still follows there is a God. We just covered this, so I must have skipped back up on accident. I must have gone over this side. Secondly, yeah, he's over here about the matter doesn't think, and no addition of matter makes it think. And then one particle does not add up to be cogitative down here. And then thirdly, because a system of incogitative matter cannot be cogitative. So what about the whole system? Is one giant mind made out of galaxies? Like you've seen that sometimes an artist will like show the brain with all of its neural networks overlap with like the universe as a giant neural network. If then neither one particular atom, and incidentally, sorry, that artistic rendering assumes you think with your brain. He's already proven you don't think with your brain, you think with your mind. If then neither one particular atom alone can be this eternal thinking being, nor all matter as matter, i.e. every particular particle of matter can be it, it only remains that it is some certain system of matter duly put together that is this thinking eternal being. That is, which I imagine is that notion which men are aptest to have of God, who would give him a material being, as most readily suggested to them by their ordinary conceit they have of themselves and other men, which they take to be material thinking beings. But this imagination, however more natural, is no less absurd than the other. For to suppose the eternal thinking being to be nothing else but a composition of particles of matter, each whereof is incogitative, is to ascribe all the wisdom and knowledge of that eternal being only to the juxtaposition of parts. So you could break up the eternal being. So here is an argument for divine simplicity. God does not have parts, cannot be broken up and destroyed or added to and built up to be even bigger and stronger. Like God is not like Voltron or something like that. Do you remember Voltron? These little robots come together to make a big robot. Okay, so whether this corporeal system, well, let me get this part here. For unthinking particles of, no, did I skip again? Nope. For unthinking particles of matter, however put together, can have nothing thereby added to them, but a new relation of position, which it is impossible should give thought and knowledge to them. So rearranging the universe doesn't make you have thought. Thought's not a material thing. Next, and that whether this corporeal system is in motion or rest. So a further consideration, this corporeal system either has all its parts at rest or it is in certain motion of the parts wherein its thinking consists. If it be perfectly at rest, it is but one lump. and so can have no privileges above one atom. Like a huge chunk of atoms doing nothing is the same as one atom doing nothing. They're both doing nothing. If it be the motion of its parts on which it thinking depends, all the thoughts there must be unavoidably accidental and limited, since all the particles that by motion cause thought, being each of them in itself without any thought, cannot regulate its own motions, much less be regulated by the thought of the whole. So there'd be no causal relationship like our thoughts. We think this thought, which leads to that thought, which leads to that thought, because we're forming an argument or a sequence. But if thought is just due to the motion of atoms and it's an accidental property, the true properties of atoms are size, shape, motion, where they're at in time, with relationships to each other. Thought is just an accidental property. But the consequence of this, whereby freedom, power, choice, and all rational and wise thinking or acting will be taken quite away, so that such a thinking being will be no better nor wiser than pure blind matter, since to resolve all into the accidental unguided motions of blind matter or thought into thought depending on unguided motions of blind matter is the same. Not to mention the narrowness of such thoughts and knowledge that must depend on the motion of such parts. But there needs no enumeration of any more absurdities and impossibilities in this hypothesis, however full of them it may be, absurdities, than that before mentioned, since, but this thinking system be all or a part of the matter of this universe, it is impossible that any one particle should either know its own or the motion of any other particle, or the whole know the motion of every other particle, and so regulate its own thoughts or motions. So the implications that the universe is God's body are that it couldn't really be a rational thinking mind. So 18, matter not co-eternal with an eternal mind. Secondly, others would have matter to be eternal, notwithstanding that they allow an eternal, cogitative, immaterial being. This, though it take away from the being of a God, yet, since it denies one and the first great piece of his workmanship, the creation, let us consider this a little bit. So it's interesting, he notes that, because Aquinas and the Greeks didn't notice that. So to say that the material universe is co-eternal with God is to take away his title as creator. He didn't create anything. He might be the former, meaning he forms the world to look different ways, but he didn't give it existence. He's not the creator. So he says, so let's consider this a little bit. Matter must be allowed eternal. Why? Because you cannot conceive how it can be made out of nothing. So here, this objection rests on the idea that creation ex nihilo is impossible. Didn't he already say something can't come from nothing? How could matter have a beginning if that's true? And this might be one of the great problems in the history of Western philosophy. Well, actually, Eastern philosophy also. Hindu philosophers wrestle with this as well. Is creation ex nihilo possible? And the Hindus and the Greeks all say, no, it's not. But Locke is going to argue, yes, it is. It's the nature of God that he created. So he says, denies a great principle. So matter must be allowed to be eternal. Why? Because you can't conceive of something coming out of nothing. Didn't you yourself just say this? You will answer, perhaps, because about 20 or 40 years since you began to be. But if I ask you what that you is, which began to exist, you can scarce tell me. The matter whereof you are made began not then to be, for if it did, then it is not eternal. But it began to be put together in such a fashion and frame as makes up your body. But yet that frame of particles is not you. It makes not that thinking thing you are. For I have now to do with one who allows an eternal, immaterial thinking being, but would have unthinking matter eternal too. Therefore, when did that thinking thing begin to be? If it did never begin to be, then have you always been a thinking being from eternity? The absurdity whereof I need not confute till I meet with one who is so void of understanding as to own it. So no one thinks that they're eternal. It's interesting he says that. We all know we had a beginning. So he says, where did you come from? The matter that makes up your body existed before you did. Where'd your mind come from? So if therefore you can allow a thinking thing to be made out of nothing, why can you also not allow it to be possible for a material thing to be made out of nothing? But that you have the experience of the one in view and not the other. Though when you will consider, creation of a spirit will be found to require no less power than creation of matter. So you grant that you had a beginning. You're not eternal. And the way you'd prove that, and why he says it's absurd, is you're not infinite. You don't have all knowledge or all power. An eternal mind would have all knowledge and all power. You don't. So your mind was created. Why do you have a problem saying matter was created? Though, when well considered, creation of spirit, so both of those take the same power. They both take the highest power or infinite power, the power of God to create. Humans don't create in that sense. An artist might say, I create. No, you rearrange things that already exist into new forms. You don't give existence to matter or mind. They already existed. So he says, nay, possibly if we would emancipate ourselves from vulgar notions and raise our thoughts as far as they would reach to a closer contemplation of things, we might be able to aim at some dim and seeming conception how matter might at first be made and begin to exist by the power of that eternal first being. But to give beginning and being to a spirit will be found a more inconceivable effect of omnipotent power. So it's just the reverse of what you think. We can imagine how matter comes into existence, but it's actually harder to imagine how spirit does, even though he grants it's possible. But this being, what would perhaps lead us too far from the notions on which the philosophy now in the world is built, it would not be pardonable to deviate so far from them, or to inquire so far as grammar itself would authorize, if the common settled opinion opposes it, especially in this place where the received doctrine serves well enough to our present purpose and leaves this past doubt, that the creation or beginning of any one substance out of nothing, being once admitted, the creation of all the other, besides the creator himself, may with the same ease be supposed. All right, so then, let me see if I wrote that down right. Once we grant that we are not eternal, we are granting that we, as a spirit, came into existence. So in the same way, matter can come into existence. Now, I was going to give a further illustration of that, though. So objection, creation out of nothing. But you will say, is it not impossible to admit of the making anything out of nothing, since we cannot possibly conceive of it? Now, conceive there is like imagining it in your mind. I'm not sure why he says we can't conceive it. I think he's granting that for the purpose of the argument. And he answers no, because it is not so reasonable to deny the power of an infinite being, because we cannot comprehend its operation. So just because we don't understand what it means for an eternal infinite being to bring something into existence, like we don't understand the mechanism, like how does that work, doesn't mean it can't happen. It's not a contradiction. We do not deny other effects upon this ground because we cannot possibly conceive the manner of their production. So our ability to imagine it happening is not the standard. The standard is reason, the law of non-contradiction. We cannot conceive how anything but impulse of body can move body. So we think that's the only cause of motion. One thing hits another thing and causes it to move. And yet that is not a reason sufficient to make us deny it possible against the constant experience we have of it in ourselves in all our voluntary motions. So he's going to say now, that's actually not the thing we're most familiar with. One thing striking another. The thing we're most familiar with is my thought, not physical. I point up here like it's my brain. My non-physical thought turning into a physical motion. In our voluntary motions, which are produced in us only by the free action or thought of our minds, and are not nor can be the effects of the impulse or determination of the motion of blind matter in or upon our own bodies, for then it could not be in our power or choice to alter it. For example, my right hand writes while my left hand is still. What causes rest in the one and motion in the other? Nothing but my will, a thought of my mind, which is non-physical, cogitative, not incogitative. The right hand, a thought of my mind, my thought only changing, and then the right hand rests and the left hand moves. This is matter of fact, which cannot be denied. Explain this and it makes everything intelligible. The thought of God about matter brings matter into existence. And it's an analogy to me moving my hand by thinking about it. The next step will be to understand creation. For the giving a new determination to the motion of the animal spirits, which some make use of to explain voluntary motion, clears not the difficulty one jot. To alter the determination of motion, being in this case no easier nor less than to give motion itself, since the new determination given to the animal spirit must be either immediately by thought or by some other body put in their way by thought, which was not in their way before, and so must owe its motion to thought. So you can't just say, well, the motion of my hand moving is from a previous motion in my shoulder, from a previous motion in my chest, from a previous motion in my neck, from a previous notion in my brain. There's going to have to be a thought that starts this off somewhere. In the meantime, it is an overvaluing ourselves to reduce all to the narrow measures of our capacities and to conclude all things impossible to be done whose manner of doing exceeds our comprehension. This is to make our comprehension infinite, or God finite, when what he can do is limited to what we can conceive of. If you do not understand the operations of your own finite mind, that thinking thing within you, do not deem it strange that you cannot comprehend the operations of that eternal mind, who made and governs all things, and whom the heaven of heavens cannot contain. So end of this section now. He concludes with this. What we can conceive, what seems reasonable to us, is not the standard. It can be mistaken and it changes. But reason, as the laws of thought, like non-contradiction, is the standard. He has used reason to show, capital R just to keep us, what is eternal and what is not eternal by considering the options and ruling out what leads to a contradiction. That's much different than just saying, this seems really hard to believe. Well, it might end up being hard to believe, but it's all you're left with. And that's the same method that mathematics uses. Geometry, you prove a theorem by positing the opposite and showing how it leads to a contradiction. So that's what he's done here. And that's why he said we can have the same certainty that God exists that we have in mathematics. And I think John Locke's given us some good things to think about here in knowing what is clear about God from the creation.